All right, good morning. My name's John Barry. I'm going to have the privilege of having you all visit our museum here at Wings Over the Rockies on Monday afternoon, and then come out to our second site at Centennial Airport, which we're going to have air shows and jumpers, and we're going to have some great speakers. It's going to be a wonderful evening. So on behalf of all of us at Wings Over the Rockies, thanks for coming, and we look forward to having you. But my responsibility today is to be able to introduce you to Scott Marchand. Now, Scott, as some of you know, is the executive director for the Arizona Aerospace Foundation at Tucson, Arizona. I don't know how many people have been to the AMARC down there. I've flown over it a bunch of times. It's absolutely incredible to see. So he's been part of nonprofits and certainly museum profession for 25 years. But he's got something that's pretty unique, I think, for us in regards to today. He's got an incredible international experience. He was at the Glenbow Museum in Calgary, Alberta, the Ashmolean, am I pronouncing that right? Okay, a museum in Oxford, England. He's got his degree in art history and museum studies from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And he lived and worked in Japan for 4 years. So talking about an international experience here, it's really a jewel to have him here. Let me just mention that the Pima Air and Space Museum was the largest and most comprehensive aviation museums in the world. It's on 80 acres. I don't know any museum's got 80 acres, but that's pretty cool. And this began in 1976. The aircraft collection is phenomenal. 400 plus aircraft, ranging from vintage and historic aircraft all the way to the modern military and commercial. I mean, you got the SR-71 there, you've got the B-29 Fortress, and just to give you an example, is the 787 Dream Chasers down there. Indoor and outdoor exhibits. I mean, some of us have that where we have an opportunity for airplanes outside, but nothing like this anywhere in the world that is on display. Educational experience is a big focus of his organization. Educational focus for informative exhibits, interactive displays, which I know is all important to all of us, educational programs for visitors of all ages. The Restoration Center is impressive. Scope extends beyond aviation, and space exploration is also included in that. And then the Boneyard, as we call it, for AMARC, is just an incredible thing to see, either on the ground or in the air. So in summary, the Pima Air and Space Museum is a world-class institution that has broken what I call walls, clocks, and calendars, which I think is pretty impressive as we go along. And I think we're going to hear an exceptional briefing from Scott and be able from there. The title of his briefing is, now that I put it back up again, Collecting, Interpreting, and Exhibiting the Vietnam War at the Pima Air and Space Museum. Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Marchand.
Good. Thank you all. Some of you know, some of you don't. I'm just going to start the presentation with, so bring it up here, with a bit of a quick overview of what the Pima Air and Space Museum is, because there's a lot of misconception too, and they even got fringes of in John's talk here. We aren't government, we aren't AMARC, we're AMARC adjacent. We're basically the bastard stepchild of the military storage facilities. I mean, they were our genesis and our formation. So as he touched upon, so we, in a nutshell, and it's an interesting story. So we got our start. We chartered in 1966, the Pima County Air Museum Foundation, which was brought about by activities at what was then called the Military Air and Space Disposition Center, or MASDIC. So it was the storage and disposition site for all government aircraft and aerospace vehicles at the time. So throughout the end of the 40s, the 50s, and early 60s, as many of you know, there was a huge upheaval in design, procurement, use, and rapid retirement of, some really shitty airplanes and some really awesome airplanes. So as a consequence, and Tucson was really a hinterland at the time. There was about 150,000 people in the civic area there, and all these facilities were way out of town, and it was a much more casual climate. So as they were conducting scrapping operations, a lot of the staff at Masdic were conscious of history and sentimental about things they had owned and flown and operated and worked on. So they started setting aside, onesies and twosies of things that should have otherwise been tossed in the smelter. Contrasting there from 1976, and this is roughly where we are today in terms of our campus and facilities and display components. We've got over 450 aircraft in the collection. We've got about 136 acres in our parcel and about 80 developed for public display and about 400,000 square feet of indoor display space. Roughly half of our collection is indoors, half of it's outdoors. The more vulnerable and historic collections are inside, but as time has gone on, things that were considered less historic and less vulnerable outside have become so. The early P-80s, the 50s era stuff, the early 60s stuff. We're a collection that, because of our proximity to A-Mark, we were able to preserve things that otherwise don't exist elsewhere or in such small numbers as to be hyper rare. So anyway, getting back to the 1960s, so this is what was called Celebrity Row. It was along one of the roads adjacent to the base. You notice there's no perimeter fences. Locals, could walk reasonably freely in and out of there on the weekends. Families were, picnicking. Not maybe the wisest choice, given the sort of cavalier approach to contamination. There was a... one thing that'll never happen, A-Mark will never close simply because the cost of cleaning it up as a Superfund site would bankrupt the nation. I've talked to pilots who are like, oh shit, we flew these airplanes in from the West Coast. The Navy guys said, it was just outside of our sort of safe return to base range, so we had to fly with full tanks, and we didn't need full tanks. So we'd land here, we'd taxi to where they were marshalling us, and the last thing we did after we shut down the airplanes was go and just open the drain on the bottom of the tanks and just drain all the fuel and oil where it sat. They had mobile smelters around here, so they were smelting magnesium and everything, and a lot of times they primed the smelters with extra TOs because the tech orders came with the aircraft and the aircraft records. So they would kindle the smelters, and then all the slag heaps would just be sort of where they left. And a slag heap's not the prettiest thing to be in proximity to. So anyway, so what happened? They'd had about 50 aircraft placed along here, and in 1962, one of the inspector generals came out and said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Well, it's kind of historic, and we're kind of, into all this stuff." And they said, "Okay, fine. You guys have had your fun, but you need to get rid of these things." And the commander at the time, he was pretty open-minded and forward-thinking, and he said, this is really not fair. We and you got to remember too. We're all familiar with Air and Space Museums now, but in this era, in the '60s, there weren't that many. Even the Air Force Museum was really just an air park collection in downtown Dayton. They had stuff stored out here, but really no means, ability, or purpose to bring them to Dayton. The Air and Space Museum in D.C. was certainly a thing, but it was appended to the castle. The major national museums that we're familiar with now were all getting their formation in this time period. Dayton formally opened in '72, the Royal Air Force Museum opened in '72, the refurbished Air and Space Museum on the Mall opened in the summer of '76, Pensacola opened in '74. So we were sort of at this advanced wave of sort of the modern air and space historic technology museum, because this was young technology at the time, and it was rapidly developing, and it was hard for people to collect contemporaneously. So anyway, a group of local leaders, congressmen, business people, civic leaders, county leaders, they formed an organization and took a proposal back to the Air Force and said, hey, if we could form a museum association, would you allow us to take these aircraft from Celebrity Row and make this a nucleus of the collection? And thankfully the Air Force and the Pentagon said, sure, that's fine. Now, what they didn't anticipate, that it was going to take us 10 years to get our act together. So we chartered in '66, but we didn't open until 1976. And this is because, Tucson remains a fairly poor community. It's out of the way. It doesn't have a lot of significance to anybody. So it was hard attracting money and interest. So it took 10 years to, secure the land, to clear the land, put fences around, meet the basic conditions for the loan programs to come into effect. But we were able to open for business by May of 1976, just in time for the bicentennial. So there was lofty ambitions at the time, you can see down here, and those clearly never came to be. It's sort of the type of thing where with a willing mind and a deep pocket, anything's possible. And, what you find is you get lots of thoughts and prayers for your initiatives, but you don't get a lot of money backing it up. As we heard from the previous talk, where even something as noble as a Vietnam Veterans Foundation display and exhibit in the nation's capital has fostered no interest even at the $4 million level. When you consider how much money is spent on Super Bowl ads, it's really kind of a travesty. So here we are. We opened. We had sort of our nucleus of 48 aircraft and a reserve collection. I mean, they were really aggressive, and we were saving a lot of stuff that otherwise wouldn't have been in existence. It started small, it continued small. Our first administrative building here was a barracks that was at the World War II barracks that was over at the base. The engineers were busy burning all those at the time and said, well, if you guys want one, we'll deliver it to you. And it's still on site, but it's basically a condemned building. Like, we don't let anybody into it anymore. It's so contaminated with lead, asbestos, and dry rot that it's just not a safe place to be into. But it still remains as a bit of a throwback. Eventually, it's probably going to fall in on itself. We have a joke that if only we could teach the termites to smoke, we'd take care of our problem in a hurry. So we got rolling, and we've steadily built and grown our organization in increments over the years. Within 4 years of opening, we had planned and opened our first display and administration building. In 1984, we partnered with the 390th Memorial Museum, which was a group that was a World War II bomb group. And they secured the loan of a B-17 from the Air Force Museum and built a spectacular facility around it, and they're devoted to the commemoration of this unit. But, veterans are interesting. The 390th was reactivated as a strategic missile wing in the 50s and until the 1980s. And the missileers and the World War II guys never, ever got along, so much so that in 1986, the B-17 guys basically kicked the missileers out of the organization and pretend that they were never perpetuated. So in that time frame, ironically, we were approached by the Air Force. The Titan II systems were being retired, and the Air Force approached us, and this is one of the last sites to be decommissioned, said, hey, we're running out of these things, and we think it would be a great idea to turn it into a museum. Would you guys want to run that on our behalf? And we said yes, and it turned into be quite an undertaking because it required the approval from the Soviet Union. It was part of several treaties. Until recently, it was still part of an inspection and compliance and overflight. I've been on several inspections and site visits to the site with Russians and the American treaty organization at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. It's the only one of its kind. If you haven't been, I highly recommend you go. It is literally a time capsule. It's pretty much as the crews walked away in 1984 after their last alert. We've grown the site and enhanced our facilities there. A little bit of where we've come from. We've changed our name. We've expanded our mission. From our earliest days, we were an Air and Space Technology Museum and History Museum, right? So we're not a military museum. We are an Air and Space Technology, right? And that's in our charter from 1966. It was recognized that although we were going to have a high component of military aircraft, we were not prejudicial to anything, right? If it flies, it fits. Love all, serve all, right? And we've pursued that mission ever since, right? So we have experimental, home-built, civil, commercial, military, foreign, domestic, you name it, rockets, Space has been hard to collect because both NASA and the Smithsonian keep a death grip on anything interesting. So we're all of us are kind of left to the breadcrumbs at the table that they don't want. So it's, our collection, admittedly, has definitely got a tip towards the military, but that's also a reflective function of the growth and development of aerospace in the 20th century, right? The militaries of all nations were the biggest drivers of innovation development, and the things that were innovated and developed spun off into commercial use, right? So it's a natural reflection of it. Where have we gotten to here? So we've continued to build and grow. We have an extensive World War II collection, which, interestingly, a lot of them actually have operational history that's not insignificant. We are also, I'm pleased to say, after several years of fundraising and planning and conspiring, we are going to be expanding our mission to a military vehicle museum, which is going to, so this is our BLM parcel. This 80 acres here we own as an institution. So it's not suitable for expansion for the air park. So, from a military standpoint, most aviation assets were developed to support the guys on the ground. And there are actually very few public nonprofit military vehicle museums in the country. The few that are there are private collections, and several are behind fortified walls at Fort Benning, and the public doesn't get to. So we've had a lot of support from our Army and Marine loan partners. We've acquired quite a few vehicles independently. I just signed a contract last week, so construction's going to start probably in November, be open in about a year. We expect to open with probably about 150 vehicles on site. We're going to have a riding and driving experience program for people. So it's going to breathe a lot of life into our organization, and there's a lot of compatible interest between air and space and ground vehicles. So, we've got one of the few Abrams available for display in the nation, M1A1s. So, with that preamble, we'll get into the Vietnam War aircraft and artifacts at our museum. So, as you notice from my preamble, we were developing and coming into being as an organization during the height of the Vietnam War, the rundown, and the aftermath. So a lot of the people involved with us at the time had been active duty, recent duty. We had a lot of people who were, career Air Force and military who served in Vietnam, Korea, World War II, who were involved. A lot of what we collected was really, at the mercy of what was available. We didn't have a lot of funds. So, fortunately, the loan programs with the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force, the Smithsonian, they were generous. And, that was also largely... There weren't really a lot of civilian competitors at that time. The vast majority of the air and space museums that we're familiar with now sort of came into being in the early 90s after the bracking process, right? So all these bases were shut down. They all had their air parks and their commemorative parks with 20, 30, 40 airplanes. And they very quickly rolled into becoming air museums in their own right. And some have been very successful, and others have struggled, and several have closed up. So the interesting, sort of piggybacking on the previous conversation, in this time frame, there is a lot of, in our incident, and I'm speaking as corporate memory from people I've talked to, from things I've gleaned from the records and contemporary attitudes. There wasn't a collective amnesia to the Vietnam War in the 1980s in this country, despite the previous remarks, and I have observations on that. But in our institution, it loomed large, because the single high point of aircraft stored at Mazdik was 6,100 aircraft in 1976, right? It's down to about 3,000 now, but everybody involved in our formation and creation was touched by the Vietnam War. The staff at Mazdik, the Air Force personnel, the wing commanders. Some of our early staff, we had shared staff with Pima County, and a number of them I've talked to, they were infantry in Vietnam. They were truck drivers, tankers, some of them Air Force mechanics. And because of the sort of the failure of the Vietnam War for our objectives. It was a loss. And nobody at that time really knew how to commemorate or celebrate a loss in the context of what they were trying to do. So they acquired these things, but the heavy emphasis was always on the commercial representation and World War II. and Korea to a lesser extent. The Vietnam era guys there, I mean, a lot of them would have been in their early 40s, right? So they weren't, I don't think they were that deeply reflective on stuff. Yes?
What year did you start at the museum?
I started in 2001, so I've been there for 22 years. So I was coming in sort of a transition point, like one of our operational predecessors was a guy named Tom Swanton. So he had actually been a B-25 pilot during World War II and was with A-26s in Korea, and then was a transportation squadron operations officer in Vietnam. And Tom's still alive, I believe. He's, I think, 102 now, and still really spry. And I talked to him a bit about this too, because he's one of our big living memories of that time period. And he said, he said, we were happy to take the airplanes as airplanes, but they were reluctant to address them as components of the Vietnam War. There was a bit of an exception in 1982 after we opened our first building. We had a fairly large exhibit that was provided by the F-105 Pilots Association, the Red River Rats, and they supplied a lot of their own personal stuff on direct loan. They didn't donate a lot of the stuff too, because until probably the early 90s, it was kind of uncertain whether or not we were going to make it. It was always kind of a bumpy road. So, they kept their hands on stuff. And at some point, in the early mid-90s, they withdrew all their material and they focused on developing their own museum. And they're still, I think, in the process of trying to open that museum. So anyway, so we ended up with, we have all kinds of aircraft. Like, I mean, in terms of comprehensiveness, we have, pretty much everything the U.S. government owned, operated, and development from, like, say, 1948 to 1985. We have a lot of aircraft who were in service during the time period of Vietnam. But, Vietnam wasn't the only place the U.S. military was. There were still 100 installations or so all over the world, into, South America, the Pacific, Europe, Central America, the Middle East. So a lot of things were focused on the NATO mission, the SAC mission, other, East Coast deployments of the Mediterranean. So even though they are of types that served in Vietnam, we have a lot of them who simply did not. So in our bomber fleet, the quintessential B-52D, these are the guys that waged all of the major bombing campaigns from 1966 to 73. Ours here, it deployed to Guam in 1967 in August with the 22nd Bomb Wing, and basically spent the next 6 years there with a few returns stateside for maintenance and upgrades, and participated in every major bombing campaign in Vietnam. We have a B-52. This aircraft was on display at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in their Warrior Park for corrosion reasons and base mission alignment. The aircraft was scrapped about 10 years ago, but through the Air Force Museum, we saved a few components of the airplane, and the crew's been by, and it gives us an interesting insight. But this airplane also spent similar 6 years in Vietnam. Interestingly, had a takeoff accident of Anderson. They had a tire burst. Fortunately, they weren't at a full combat load. Otherwise, they would have been a smoking hole on the runway. But they managed to bring the aircraft to a halt, and everybody survived. The aircraft was repaired, went back into service, and retired into Tucson in 1982 with most of the B-52Ds that were retired at that point. We have another B-52G that I haven't included in the slide here because the internal legend is that it was in Vietnam, but in the aircraft records, I was not able to find anything that confirmed that. It was a G, it was SAC. Its claim to fame is it was one of the secret squirrel aircraft that flew the longest combat mission in history up until that point, the first night of the first Gulf War. It was Doom 26. They took 26 cruise missiles over Baghdad, January 16th from Barksdale, Louisiana, and back. It was, I think, a 34-hour mission. Only recently eclipsed by some B-2s. But anyway, so our other interesting bomber, and this is also a rarity, was the B-26 Counter Invader. So it started life in World War II, was a training aircraft, air guard aircraft. It was actually close to being surplused when Special Operations Command wanted to get some really focused counterinsurgency and interdiction aircraft developed. So a private company called Onmark took hold of about a dozen of these aircraft and developed them what's called the B-26K. And I think there's only 3 that are still in existence. So they were hardened to carry extensive ordnance, a gun package in the nose, and they did a lot of night interdiction up and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Our particular one was with the 56 Special Operations Wing on what was called a Nimrod mission, and so it was about a year in Vietnam before it dropped from surplus and was assigned to us in 1972. You can see down here in the picture, that's basically as it arrived in its operational markings from Vietnam. We've tried to find here as many sort of in-use photos from the period. We have a weird little curse in our museum that every airplane we have, nobody ever seems to have taken a picture of, right? We can find, the serial numbers above and below, we know it did this stuff, but, we find people like massive online, like all these unit associations, unit histories, everybody's got like a walk around of almost every airplane that they used, except for the ones that got preserved. Our B-57 was deployed to Clark in the Philippines and did a lot of forward deployments to Vietnam and a lot of special missions as well. Our intruder was in Vietnam. You can see it is this airplane right here, and the image, the date on that's roughly 1971, best we can tell. It was with the Kitty Hawk. It served for many, many more years. So a lot of these things, we collected because they're good examples of the type. They happen to have this history. The institution itself wasn't super focused on Vietnam history as a specific subject matter. So what happened sort of culturally, we came out of the war, we collected these things. The 80s saw a lot of popular interest in the Vietnam conflict. You had movies. So I'm born and raised in Western Canada, up in Calgary. So my experience is at a distance. I was in elementary school in the 70s. My first sort of conscious, I was always interested in military service. My family's got a lot of history with the Royal Canadian Air Force back to the First World War. My eyes were never good enough to get into the Air Force in Canada, and I wasn't smart enough to do anything else in the military that they wanted, like engineering. So I got the second best job. But we were very acutely conscious of military history. I mean, I'm 55 now, so when I was in elementary school in the 70s, almost every other person up and down the street was my age but a World War II veteran. And there was a lot of kids roaming around, and these guys were happy to tell us bullshit war stories, true war stories. We wore their uniforms for Halloween costumes. My next door neighbor, whose dog I used to walk, he went ashore with the Calgary Highlanders on D-Day at Juno Beach. So we were steeped in it. And a lot of my dad's friends from Winnipeg, they went to Vietnam as Canadians. And we'll talk about that more extensively, but parenthetically, as fast as Americans were dodging the draft, Canadians were flooding south. There were close to 30,000 Canadians served in Vietnam, and one of my dad's friends won the Silver Star. And then one of my best friends in high school, his dad was a draft dodger, and he was a lovely guy, right? And so it was a very complicated time frame, but we were conscious of this stuff. But as a Canadian, our relationship to the Vietnam War was at a bit of a remote distance and a little, I guess, naive. The BBC series The 10,000 Day War came out in 1978, which is a fantastic documentary. I was blown away by Apocalypse Now the first time I saw it when I was about 13. Deer Hunter. There was a lot of stuff came in rapid fire. There were several TV series. You've got Full Metal Jacket, Platoon, Call of Duty, China Beach. A lot of books like Chicken Hawk, Bright Shining Lie. It was out there, right? And I know there's a lot of popular sentiment in the country that, Vietnam veterans weren't recognized or commemorated. The myth isn't really true. I mean, the reality is the Vietnam Monument in Washington, D.C. was commissioned, designed, development, and dedicated within 12 years of the end of the war, in 1984. In 1985, in New York City, they had a ticker tape parade for Vietnam veterans that saw 25,000 veterans participate and almost 1 million spectators. By contrast, the Victory Parade for World War II in New York only had 13,000 soldiers participating, and a quote here, the tone at the time was noted in the press as being markedly subdued. This is after conquering the Nazis in Japan. I mean, and also after Gulf War I, Vietnam veterans were also included in that commemoration. I think it's this problem with how do you commemorate the noble service of servicemen in the context of a defeat. And, we're still struggling with this. And this leaks into how we've tried to interpret our Vietnam artifacts in the museum. So we have lots of fighters here. Our 105 is popular because this was part of the 355th Fighter Wing, and the 355th is Davis Monthan. They weren't headquartered there at the time, but they came there after the war, and the veterans community has sort of focused around the base and the mission and our wing, and they've had several reunions out here. One of their aircraft here, Big Sal, spent 4 years in Vietnam, and it's remarkable that it survived because 105s suffered about a 50% loss rate, like total destruction, not just damage. A lot of pilots who ended up as prisoners of war were 105 pilots. The nickname Big Sal here. So Big Sal was the madam at the unit's most popular brothel outside the gates in Thailand. So our G model was Wild Weasel. It's one of the early ones in Vietnam. It was using the Wild Weasel role. So this was, many of you know, this was an electronic countermeasures aircraft that was used to suppress radar and anti-aircraft sites. To escort the D models to try and settle down the loss rates that they were suffering. A lot of the losses of the 105s were a consequence of the mission planning being done out of the Pentagon by guys like McNamara, who insisted on them flying the same mission profile at almost a regular schedule. So, the Vietnamese counter batteries were able to basically dial in exactly where they needed to shoot. So, a lot of failure. Look, Vietnam is a weird war. I mean, it was corporatized. It was high intensity, high tempo, but it was never popularly supported in Vietnam. For almost everybody that was involved or alive at the time, you have a difference of opinion about its relative merits, I guess. So that's led to sort of the. It's easy to interpret and exhibit subjects and topics that there's broad sort of popular consensus about. Very few people who are sane are going to argue that that World War II wasn't a noble, important, and clean-cut good guys and bad guys war writ large. There's always going to be complicated individual incidents, but in the big picture, I don't think anybody, will make the case that, maybe we should have just learned to live with the Nazis, right? And you had people that were citizen soldiers rapidly mobilized, trained, and deployed almost as a unit and demobbed at the same rate. The high intensity involvement of American World War II amounted to about 3 years. So, these guys came back, they had a unique experience, a strong experience, and sort of a collective sense of purpose, right? They came back to, GI Bills. Look, it doesn't mean they didn't suffer from personal psychological issues. There was a lot of sort of social upheaval as a consequence of World War II as well. But from a museum standpoint, it's a lot easier to talk about the good guys fighting the bad guys. Whereas in Vietnam, those lines are a lot grayer. Our F4 was over there and has a MiG kill, shot down a MiG-15 in 1967. Our Navy F4 was on the, it's painted up in Ranger markings. Vietnam has been called the helicopter war, right? And not undeservedly. There was something in the neighborhood of, so the Air Force flew over 2 million sorties. The Navy, the Marines, and the Army had a similar intensity as well, but the helicopters, the U.S. military deployed nearly 12,000 helicopters to Southeast Asia, and 5,000 of them were lost in combat. So, and the Huey sort of became the icon of that war. So we have several helicopters over there. So our Piasecki Shawnee was actually over before the official hot war as part of Advisory Command, Song Trang. So this is one of our stars. It served with several different units, but it spent most of its time with the 174th Assault Helicopter Company, which were the Sharks and the Dolphins. So the Sharks were the gunship element, and the Dolphins were the slicks. In 2010, we built a building expansion, and one of the things we really wanted to do was build in a Vietnam War exhibit to bring some recognition to this. And so we did the research on our helicopter and discovered its history, and started reaching out to the unit, and a lovely man named Dick Overham got in touch with me, and Dick had been with the 14th Air Force in World War II and was a professional warrant officer in the Army, and stayed in through Korea, the peacetime, and was one of the first Army warrant officer helicopter pilots. Went over with the unit in 1965, and he actually got official permission. I mean, lots of Vietnam aircraft flew with nose art and helicopters, but he actually got the official sanction to put the shark's mouth on their helicopters from General Westmoreland's staff and from 14th Air Corps headquarters. Our Kiowa, so a lot of the stuff too is, social media has been a really important part of learning more about what our aircraft did, because the military record cards don't always tell you everything you want to know. So when we get stuff and post up to social media, we'll routinely get guys sending emails like, "Hey, that's my bird. I flew it. Here's some pictures." And this was the case here when we got our Kiowa in 2007. We very quickly got an email from a guy who was one of its pilots, and it was with. It was with D Troop, 1st Squadron, 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers from November 1970 to December 71, and did 1,500 operational hours. And it had just been at an Army air park in Amarillo, Texas, that closed up, and nobody had really paid much attention to it. It was still in its guard unit markings. Our OH-6 was also, it was with 3rd Squadron, 17th Cav in Vietnam, 1970, did ground reconnaissance element for the 3rd Brigade, 82nd Airborne Division. They nicknamed themselves the Scalp Hunters, and Vietnam air operations alone, setting aside everything else, is a fascinating rabbit hole. Like, if you have any kind of curiosity about this stuff, you can pick any thread about any of these units at almost any point in time, and the things that were going on are just, mind-blowing in their complexity and significance. Our Tarhi here was in Vietnam, and I have a little video of it that I don't know if I'm going to be able to. Oh, yeah. So this is a home movie that somebody took. It was a recovery operation of an OV-10 Bronco, and when the video zooms in a little larger, you can see the nose number 437 clearly up on front of it. We have other pictures of it resupplying fire bases like Quai Son. He was in country for about 6 years, and these were instrumental in all sorts of heavy lift and evacuation operations and salvage operations. So a lot of patrol and observation aircraft. Our Lockheed YO3A Quiet Star, there's a picture of it in Vietnam. It's part of the test program. These were developed from a glider platform into a low-altitude stealth aircraft. It was using a lot of very early infrared and television observance stuff. So they had a pilot and an electronic systems operator in the back seat, and they were meant for low-level night reconnaissance in Cambodia, Laos, and up and down the Vietnam Ho Chi Minh Trail. And they would fly at about 100 feet, and they were deadly silent. It was a low-horsepower engine, big, fat, slow-turning propeller that was driven by rubber drive bands instead of a drive shaft, and the exhaust was completely muffled. So once it was about 30, 40 feet off the ground, you wouldn't know it was over top of you. It retired shortly after Vietnam. The FBI used it for several years, and then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service used it for about 20 years for surveillance and countering fisheries poaching in the Gulf. Sold out through GSA in the early 90s, and we acquired it. Our Lockheed AP, this is an interesting story. So the Navy messed around with special operations stuff too, but they never really, embraced it because they were focused on carrier warfare rather than shore stations, right? So you get little exotic units like the Sea Wolves with their Hueys and their Cobras, but the AP-2Hs, they were modified Neptunes. They did 4 of these things. They up-armored them and festooned them with all kinds of guns, grenade launchers, rockets, mortars, and they had a very early night vision system, forward infrared cameras, and they basically for about 8 months, they specialized in flying up and down the coast of Vietnam and up and down the rivers into Hanoi at about 100 feet, just blasting whatever was in their way. The Navy retired the program. 2 of the aircraft were scrapped. 1 survives at Pensacola and 1 survives with us. Our other Neptune was with VP2 and spent about 4 years in and out of Vietnam with general deployments, just doing coastal reconnaissance. Our Mohawk was there for about 6 years with different units, and here's a picture of it in country. We've had several guys from the unit out our way. They comes in 1s and 2s, but what we found with a lot of the veterans, they don't really want to. They haven't organized and formalized the way a lot of other World War II Korea units have. And we're seeing similar now with sort of the modern veterans from the Global War on Terror. They're not really coalescing, because the participation of these units was such a time span, right? I mean, you have guys, I know people personally at DM who, they're 45 years now. They were in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2003, and at the end of their deployment, they're with guys who are 19 who were in kindergarten. So there isn't the same sort of generational commonality. You have the same sort of rotation in and out. Some units and things have really, really hairy deployments, and other guys are like, I spent my time at the Starbucks in Kuwait. So it's and Vietnam sort of has a similar tempo to it, with the way, you did your tour and it was based on when you went in country and how many points or hours or dates you got, and then you came out. So you didn't train and formate as a crew like a B-17 would have, right? And come back sort of as a unit. So a lot of the guys didn't form the same bonds, right? Like even when we had the 174th guys, and I've been in touch with another unit, the 118th, they have these website and Facebook groups, and that's really where they're focusing their camaraderie, right? They're not getting together to go to a hotel like this for a weekend of drinking and hanging out, because, a lot of them there's 10 or 15 years difference. I mean, they're connected by the unit, but they're not connected by personal relationships. Our Morning Star flew out of Taiwan for several years doing electronic stuff up and down the coast, command and control, basically an early AWACS type of airplane. I didn't illustrate it here because it's kind of one of these gray areas. We have an EC-135, which was an airborne battlefield command post, and best we can tell, it legitimately was the very last American aircraft out of Vietnam airspace in 1975 after the fall of Saigon. It coordinated the withdrawal. So it doesn't matter what helicopter was the last one off of the roof in Saigon. Lots of people like to argue about that, but this was the last airplane. So, but because we had really kind of left Vietnam, I was like, does it really count? But our tracer did about 7 deployments with various carriers from 1964 to 71. Our recent acquisition that had been kind of a big hole in our collection was the de Havilland caribou. They were used extensively in Vietnam by the Army, and this one in particular was seconded to the ARVN squadrons, and there's still faint remnants of the tail flashes of the ARVN painted out on the tail. Haven't been able to get any discrete history on this one yet. I'm working with the Caribou Association to sort of track that down. So there we go. So artifacts, right? So artifacts tell your stories. Museums are about artifacts. Personally, with myself and our staff, our interpretive exhibits, we base around artifacts. There's a lot of places that pick a theme, they put a book on the wall, they sprinkle a few things in, but it's largely an audio-visual type of thing, and we kind of take the attitude that, like, I love museums, but I want to go to see the real stuff. I want to see the historic stuff. I want to, interact with an actual artifact. I mean, I want the information, but I don't want to go and read a book on the wall about Herculaneum and Pompeii. I want to see the stuff that was there, right? And we sort of take the same approach with our exhibitry here. I mean, there's lots of interesting exhibits we could do, but we don't have the material to support that exhibitry and interpretation. And, we don't actually, despite being a big place, we don't have a lot of space for these smaller exhibits, right? Our hangars are taken up by a lot of airplanes, so these things end up sort of confined to the edges of our spaces, along low points, around where transition areas are, but our open space is taken up by airplanes, and we don't fly, we're a static museum, but we're anything but static. Stuff moves all the time, right? You get more airplanes, you stuff more stuff inside, you think your building's full, you get something, you scoot stuff a little bit more together, hang something from the roof. So we don't do a lot of stuff that's physically set on the floor, because we know, relatively, that's almost the inbuilt curse. If we put something on the floor, within 8 months, we're going to have to blow it out and move it because something's going to come along that we weren't planning on. So, like I said, in 2010, we decided it was time, it was overdue that we do a focused exhibit on the Vietnam Air War. We kind of copped out a little bit and focused on the Air War because we're an Air and Space Technology and History Museum. There's a much wider scope of the Vietnam War, but we're not a military history museum. So, interpreting the Air War was a little easier for us, thankfully. So we've got about 100 linear feet of display here, and we cover material. We don't have a lot of Vietnam artifacts, but we have some very good ones. We have prisoner of war suits from captivity in Hanoi, and the prisoner hats. The uniforms are from guys who all flew, in our F4 or Misty missions or 105s. We have Navy stuff over here. One of the jackets here, I wasn't able to get a good picture of on display, but he did a short deployment in Vietnam for 3 months and then went back to instructor duties, and then was sent to South Texas. And look, there's a lot of humor, black humor around Vietnam. I mean, there's a lot of guys who are really sort of uptight and warrior about it, and a lot of guys were really kind of flip about it. The Vietnam Zippos, you have all sorts of unofficial patches. I mean, Peanuts and Snoopy and the gang were lampooned and incorporated a lot of this. But on his jacket on the right sleeve, he's got a big patch, 1,000 combat-free hours in the Gulf of Mexico, right? So these are interesting too, and Chris Henry, they've got a bunch of similar stuff at the EAA. One of our local guys, a really crazy guy, Mike Cusick, he was door gunner and engineer on the Hueys with this unit in Vietnam, and these are nose art panels that he kept after they changed. And the Tiger 22, if you notice, the Tiger's cross-eyed, right? So so what happened is they had a captain change in the rotation and order the unit to remove their Viking and put the Tigers on their nose, and the unit wasn't really happy about it. So in sort of protest, instead of making the Tiger look fierce and ferocious, they made him cross-eyed. And it took about 6-8 weeks before the powers noticed and they were ordered to replace them. So he wrapped these panels up and mailed himself to him home. And they were just in his house for years. But Mike stayed in the reserves, the guard, law enforcement for almost 50 years. And he was actually, we're getting helicopter from Sarah, I think in the new year, an MH-60 PJ thing, and I'm drawing a blank. But Mike, it was a Medal of Honor rescue mission in Afghanistan. And Mike, at 58 years old, was on the aircraft as a civilian contractor, and while all the Air Force PJ guys were involved in a firefight, Mike hauled the wounded into the helicopter for the dust-off, right? There's a movie made about it now, and we sponsor a podcast series, an aviation podcast series, so Mike's got an hour-long episode about his career that it's called The Damcasters, so if you want to listen to some really crazy stuff, Mike's the guy to talk to, but he's the most unassuming, modest guy you're ever going to meet. So we're sort of a big macro artifact type of place, right? We have a lot of airplanes, a lot of related equipment. In our catalog system, we've got, close to 11,000 cataloged artifacts of all eras, right? So World War I, civil and commercial. And we probably have 2 or 3 times that number uncatalogued and unprocessed. We're chronically short-staffed, and the paperwork stuff kind of gets away from us. It's a tedious process, so we've got a big backlog, right? But out of this, discreetly, only 377 have Vietnam in the description, right? And 224 of them are distinct objects within archival collections. There's a little bit of overlap. We're going to guess that there's probably a similar proportion of other Vietnam stuff that hasn't been processed that's come in as part of other collections. And then one aspect of the way museums collect and receive things, until comparatively recently, we relied on donations, right? We're an Air Force town. We're a little bit out of the way. And so, a lot of the World War II veterans, Korean veterans, or even First World War veterans and their families, in the 70s and 80s, socially people were much more sort of vested in museums as being worthwhile things, local historical societies. And, the first thought of something old or significant in the family that they didn't want or got out is, let's approach a museum. But, collecting in the internet has risen since the late 80s and 90s. So what we found, certainly from the early 2000s, is the vast majority of things that normally we probably would have seen as offers of donations, ended up on eBay. They went to auction companies. They've gone into private collections. And there's certainly no reason that's none of those things are legitimate. Those are family choices. A lot more stuff is staying with families, I have to say, though, too. Generations are sustaining interest in families' military services in ways that weren't typical in, say, the 1980s. I've got a large personal collection of First and Second World War British and Canadian aviation and infantry stuff, and I got a lot of stuff from families. They just were not interested, right? It was either the garbage or me. Museums, there weren't any museums for them to go to as such. When I first started working at the Glenbow, one of the senior curators there, a guy named Doug Light, had a big collection of Canadian infantry badges from the First World War. And he, and how he developed this is in high school in the 50s, his part-time job was with the Salvation Army, sort of an equivalent of Goodwill. And they would do what they called rag drives, right? So people would flush out all their old, and the military stuff was really seen as junk. Houses were smaller. People weren't that sentimental about World War II until the late 80s and early 90s. I know lots of veterans said, I didn't think about it until I retired in the 90s, and then the 50th anniversaries came along. My family had people lost in World War II, and my grandfather said, I'd much rather have your uncle than this pile of shit. So people weren't that sentimental. It was a brutal war, right? So they had these rag drives, and they get all these military uniforms donated. And Doug's job was trimming the buttons and metal insignia off the uniforms before they went into the rag shredders. So this is how we got all this stuff, right? I remember in high school in the 80s up in Canada, we'd be playing paintball, and we would go down to the local Crown Surplus, and Commonwealth surplus had kind of dried up, but there was a lot of American surplus was being sold. And there were bales and bales and bales of Vietnam-era stuff. We were playing paintball in infantry unit matched stuff, and would trash these things over 4 or 5 months and go get another one for $5. The Jungle Boots come in. And that was typical in the 50s too. All this stuff from World War II was surplus. The guys wore their painted A2 jackets to fix their house. They went to school in them. They hot rodded in them. They, bought flight suits for duck hunting. It's the course of a natural human progression, right? So what we found is in the 80s and 90s, we had a lot of waves of World War II stuff with Vietnamese stuff sprinkled in because it was a function of the careers some of these guys had, not because it was specifically about Vietnam, right? So what we're finding now, though, as the Vietnam generation hits their 70s and 80s and are starting, you're seeing this generational die-off of that generation. More and more families are hanging on to it, and we're getting a little bit of stuff, but where we've been able to grow and expand our collection is through purchase. We've purchased a lot of stuff from eBay, from auction companies to fill in these gaps. Last year I picked up a fairly extensive Air America pilots group, which we weren't otherwise going to have donated. So I guess the silver lining to that, speaking selfishly, is when we buy stuff, we don't have to deal with the inevitable family that comes back 2 generations later. You're not displaying my granddad's stuff. Give it back to me. You're not worshiping my uncle. So, well, we got his lunch pail, right? How do you build an exhibit around that, right? Yeah. So purchasing these things has made our interpretive efforts a lot easier because we can target what we want to say, and we're able to, dive in on some of the fringes. One thing we like to do is, when we can, is some of these fringe stories, like the special operations groups or the smaller units. So this is some of the stuff we have in the collection. So we're in the process of we're going to be 1,000 square feet of storage space where everything goes, right? We try to be as responsible as we can and judicious about stuff, but it's a big task. Being the custodians of people's material memory and culture is important, and we don't take it lightly. So I want to touch on the 174th a little bit because this is really an interesting thing for a lot of us. Myself and my curatorial staff, we're roughly the same age, give or take 5 years. So we've got a similar cultural experience with this stuff. We all kind of grew up immersed in World War II. Vietnam was one of these things that was kind of a tangent for us. So when we opened the display in 2012 in Vietnam, we restored our 174th gunship and got in touch with the unit. We paid for and hosted the first unit reunion they've ever had, and to this point, still remains the only one they've ever had. Right? So we had about 3 dozen of these guys come out, and it was under the umbrella of a Huey helicopter symposium, right? So the reason we did that is we'd had a lot of pressure to do these public events, and Tucson and our museum's visitorship is transient. 90% of our visitation is out of region, and it's one and done, right? So we don't have a big local audience, right? So when we do these events, nobody ever shows up unless it happens to be a busy time of the year where people are already there, right? So if people are in the region, they're traveling, and we're doing something, they'll participate, but nobody's making it a destination. So we wanted to test this and say, okay, so if we really make a focus and publish, and push out this idea of a Vietnam forum, a Huey forum. Look, it's one of the most iconic helicopters ever built. Everybody knows it. We thought, okay, if anything's going to draw a crowd, this is going to be it. Well, I can tell you it didn't happen. And but it was a really cool experience for us, because we had the 174th guys there, and they were wonderful, and the stories they told. And one element of the exhibit we did that I haven't shown here. So we've got sort of a history versus Hollywood, right? So one of the guys in the 174th was one of their instructor pilots and check pilots, and he had his own Super 8 film camera, and he mounted up in his Huey, and he did a lot of private filming while he was in Vietnam, and we've got copies of all this stuff. And we had sort of the famous helicopter assault from Apocalypse Now running sort of in contrast. And, the guys that were really early from the units, like 65, 66, really didn't like the Apocalypse Now stuff. They thought it was really, that's not our experience, and that wasn't how I don't know. But the guys from 68, 69, 70 are like, that's mild by contrast with some of the stuff that we were involved in, right? One of the guys who was there, he was with the Sharks. He was actually on top cover during the My Lai massacre. He had no idea what was going on, found out afterwards, and the unit itself was called out in the congressional investigation, and their CEO had to testify that, hey, look, we knew nothing, right? So, it was a while, like different times of the war in different places, it was a very different experience for everybody. So it's impossible to draw sort of a collective stroke about all this. So that's Dick's letter for permission for the thing. So one thing that was interesting too, that at the time, so they gave us a bunch of cockpit recordings. So what was happening is there's a rise in consumer technology. Cassette recorders are getting more common. A lot of guys did audio letters home to the family instead of writing. And several of the guys in the unit, a lot of different units, it was really simple to just sort of jack your cassette player into the aircraft comm systems, and they would record missions. And this... oh, here, let me get this. I don't know if I can get this audio rolling or not. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Right, so we've got a lot of this kind of stuff, and this was a fairly typical. And some of the guys were really enthusiastic about it, others weren't. Some kept them, some didn't. But we've got probably 40 or 50 segments of this from the 174th over to that was from the Lam Som raid in Cambodia, where they suffered incredible losses. And the one I just played, that was Witch Doctor. That crew was completely lost. We have other ones from B-52 crews that recorded during linebacker missions and Christmas bombings. So these are things that are more of a challenge to exhibit and interpret, because we saturate our audience at the museum with a lot of stuff, right? So we tend to be very sort of short in our labels, because we were a little wordy a while ago, and we had a lot of complaints from people like, there's too much to read. I can't look at everything. I can't read everything. It's mentally exhausting. So we've throttled it back. And when people ask for more information, well, say we stock the gift store with books, and this is our recommendation. So we had our symposium in 2013. We had some of the last Huey helicopter pilots in the Air Force from Alamogordo, New Mexico come out. We had lots of guys from Vietnam, some foreign guys, some Australians, some really fascinating panels. At most, we had a room about maybe this many people at the high point. One of the things we was able to do is I got a hold of Bob Mason, who wrote the book Chicken Hawk. Now, if you haven't read it, it's a fabulous book. It's maybe not to everybody's taste, but it's an honest account of his war. And that's Bob in Vietnam. That's him at our symposium. I know the guys up at Dillon Aerospace in Phoenix. They're an arms manufacturer. They've got Huey gunship that they play with, and they brought their Huey down for the whole 3 days of the forum. They did regular flights throughout the day. Their regular pilot, Greg Aguilera, Slick, he was in Vietnam, did 3 tours there. And so we got Bob Mason up in the helicopter, and turns out that was the first time he had been in a helicopter since the last time he rotated out of Vietnam. So he went for a 30-minute flight out there. So what's the future? Well, we're looking to update and reinstall. They're rare. We purchase stuff, random donations. What we are finding is that the Middle Eastern wars are now overshadowing everybody's interest, right? There is not a strong social or veteran interest in exhibiting the Vietnam War much anymore, right? It all kind of got swept aside with the Gulf War I being the 100-hour triumph, and then the 50th anniversary of World War II, and then the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq have created a whole new veteran community, right? So we've been collecting that stuff. I mean, we're getting more focus from the A-10 community, from the Kiowa Warrior community, the MH-53 community. I mean, and weirdly, a lot of these guys contemporaneously are much more interested in having their stories saved in museums. So I think it's a big cultural shift, right? So they're much more forthcoming about this stuff in the immediacy of their service rather than waiting 30 or 40 years. So I don't know what the future looks like for Vietnam commemoration. I mean, we're heading to the point where the last Second World War veterans are going to be dying and a memory. Korea's not far behind, and we've got board members who were Vietnam 105 pilots who were 89 years old, and sort of the youngest volunteers we have were involved were 71 years old, right? So this is rapidly fading into collective memory, and we feel an urgency to save as much of the stuff as we can, because I don't know that there's going to be as much generational interest in having this stuff find its way to museums. So with that, I will wrap it up.